Thanks, Thomas. Thanks, everyone, for coming. As you said, I'm Grant Ingersoll. I'm the CTO of Lucidworks. I've been a long-time Lucene Solar committer, started the Mahout machine learning project. This talk is a very high-level beginner talk. I like to say, people often ask me, what does a CTO do? And I usually say we do three things. I call them the three C's. We write code, we meet with customers, and we go to conferences. This talk is derived out of that second one, meeting with customers. And so what I want to do today is shape the things I often see, both bad and good, in how people are implementing search based off of all of the years that I've been doing this, all the scars that I have, so on. But I'm going to do it by relating it to some classic video games. So I would encourage you, I'm going to try to have a little fun with this. If you see a video game that you like, feel free to shout it out. Afterwards, if you see a video game that maybe I missed that you wanted to see for my next talk, tweet it at me or something along those lines. Let me know why I should include your favorite video game in this. If you don't recognize all of these games, go look them up afterwards. I want to start off first with pitfalls that I often see around search. This was an early Atari 2600 game. I think a good year of my life was probably wasted playing this game or something along those lines. But so I want to dig in a little bit and put this in the context and start off with the very first one, which I see as a very common pitfall amongst a lot of search engineers and people implementing search. And I can actually share my own personal journey here. And that is, as an engineer, especially a server-side engineer, I think that I know how to write JavaScript. And I think I know how to write CSS, and I think, therefore, I know how to write a UI. And I've done lots of search UIs over the years, but my UIs usually look like this. And in fact, I'm sure if you were honest with yourself about the way you, as a back-end search engineer, write UIs, your UIs probably look like this as well. And one of the key things I've learned at my time at Lucidworks is in the early days of our company, we did not invest enough in UI. And more importantly, we did not invest enough in user experience. So one of the things I would encourage you to all go and think about is, how do we invest more in not just UI, but user experience? What is the right way for you to show data to your users? And how do you learn from how they interact with that data such that you don't have this hacked up, ugly looking console gaming device? Number two, I see a lot of people who obsess over exact results in their search pages. And that can be good to a certain extent until you start to find yourself going crazy. And in particular, I see a lot of people who treat anything that's not the very first result as being, that first loser, right? And so I would encourage you to think about relevance, and we'll talk about relevance a bit more as we go and we get into some of the best practices side of the equation here. But one of the things I like to tell people just up front is anything that's above the fold you should consider as being pretty good, and then you can tweak from there. But don't lose all your hair over, is number two, why isn't that number one? I can't tell you the number of customers I've been at where their bosses come into them and say, could you make that one number one? And then they go spend 6 weeks making it number one, and then they broke all of their other queries. And so we'll talk a little bit about how you solve for that problem as an engineer, dealing with people who don't get all of this fuzzy, statistical, probabilistic, vector space matching works. Anyone familiar with this game? Some people credit this game as being the game that ruined the Atari 2600, that actually caused it to stop being sold. And in fact, I think a few years ago, this is E.T., the extraterrestrial game. I think a few years ago, if you go Google it on Wikipedia, they found like 50,000 copies of this in some landfill in Arizona in the United States. If you've ever played it, it is an awful user experience. So I would encourage you to go find an emulator and try it yourself. The point of this game, though, is often that E.T., which is that really nice 8-bit pixelated green blobby thing up there, he often, or she, whatever E.T. is, often falls into a pit. and then E.T. can't get out, and there were so many bugs in this game that the game would glitch out at this point, or you get killed by whatever that thingy is there, it's a snake. The point being, in search, I often find customers get stuck in a pit when it comes to thinking about relevance. They've got their bosses and things like that telling them this is how search should be. They think about search in only one way. And so then they end up in this pit, and then they wonder why they're not able to monetize their results properly or get feedback back to their customers appropriately. And so I would encourage you to think about, where are you? Are you stuck in that pit? How could you leapfrog out of that? And in the rest of the talk here, we'll get to some of these things as well. One of the common pits that I find people in are what I like to call pet peeve queries. This is, I don't know if people are familiar with this English saying, but a pet peeve query, this is like your personal favorite query. This is the system, I guarantee if you've ever developed a search application, you have like 1 or 2 queries that you run all the time. My very first search engine, I was building a cross-language search engine between English and Japanese. How many people speak Japanese here? Anyone? Nope. I don't speak Japanese either. Guess what my query was? It was literally the word Japan. The 2 characters that the Japanese speaker that I was working with on the system taught me, those 2 characters, and that was the query I used every time I tested whether that system was working, until we actually had live, real data, right? The other kinds of pet peeve queries I often see are actually the boss's pet peeve queries. Sure, I see some people nodding their heads. The boss comes in, hey Joe, hey Jane, search is broken. I did a search for fill in the blank, and the results are terrible. Fix it. And then now you go off, and again, you're in that local minimum, you're stuck tuning those queries. I see a lot of people nodding here. Yes, we'll talk how to get out of pet peeve queries here in a minute. Next up, I see a lot of people just getting lucky. How many people are familiar with Super Meat Boy? We got a few fans. We're getting a little bit more modern here. By my son's account, and I think many other people on the internet, Super Meat Boy is probably the single hardest video game ever made. I don't know if you agree or disagree with that, but when I play Super Meat Boy with my son, I sometimes get through a level. And usually when I think about it, it's because I'm lucky, right? The thing that I often see in the search world that relates to Super Meat Boy is also kind of similar to what is sometimes called as the Oprah effect, if you're familiar with Oprah Winfrey. It's that this case where, as a developer or as a business, we have these great ideas. These are awesome. These are going to make the company another $1 million a day or whatever it is. And we go and deploy them, and voila, they worked. But what we didn't realize and what we didn't test for is, are we just getting lucky, right? So the story around the Oprah effect is that one day this company redesigned their website. They went live, they launched, etc. And it just, and traffic went through the roof on their new site. And they were sitting there congratulating themselves on how smart they were. And then somebody came in the next day and said, oh, did you watch Oprah last night or yesterday? We were on it. And Oprah was the reason why everybody was coming to their website and why it was performing so high. And so these are things where you start to employ A/B testing and AA testing and other kinds of analysis to make sure that the changes you're making aren't just about you getting lucky. Because let's face it, rare events happen, right? So make sure you're doing the math to understand whether you're just getting lucky or this stuff is really working. And there's a lot of good tools out there and a lot of good information on these kinds of things. Next one, any Portal fans? All right, now we're, got retro games, now we got the newer ones. One of the things I like to think about with search is in Portal, if you don't know, you can basically jump between, cross time and dimension and all of that kind of stuff, right? You have this little gun and it opens up these portals to other dimensions. One of the things that I often see developers make is they make assumptions that their system can't do something. Right? Oh, it's a search engine. Well, I would never use that as a key value store. Or it's a search engine. What's that got to do with collaborative filtering style recommendations? Why would I do recommendations in a search engine? Or, hey, I can't store my time series data in something like Lucene. That's just crazy. I need to go have a time series database. And so I would challenge you to think about what assumptions do you have in your application, and then think about what is the best way to solve those. We see time and time again, for instance, so one of the old ones in Lucene was, Lucene's not fast enough for doing that. Or, why do I have to send in and redo the whole query every time I do a search? Can't I just be smarter and cache and do something about those kinds of things? But the people who would ask those questions never actually tested whether it was fast enough or not. They just assumed it was. So I would encourage you to leave you with that. I would also encourage you to think about things like whether just because a user, one of the other assumptions I see is just because a user types in one set of queries, that's the only query that you should run against your system, or that you should even run a query at all. If you think about it, the user is really after an information need. They want an answer. Some queries, they just need that exact answer. And so if you know that answer ahead of time, if somebody comes on your site and the first thing they do is search for Super Meat Boy, then just give them straight up Super Meat Boy. You don't need to go do anything else. You probably don't even need to hit your search engine. The other side of this is the invisible queries, is the notion that just because a user does one query doesn't mean you have to only do one query, right? I once worked with a company, this was in the travel space, where for any given user query, they would often have as many as 14 different queries, depending on how well, kind of a back-off strategy, depending on how well things worked as they went down the chain. So that's some of the common pitfalls. I played a lot of Mario Brothers, Super Mario Brothers, so I just have this one up here as a segue to talk about best practices. Not that I have any specific rules or thoughts on Mario, other than it was my favorite game in college, not to date myself there. So some best practices. Anybody remember Zero Wing? Nobody remembers this game other than everybody remembers them saying, all your bases belong to us. It was a classic case of bad translation. The interesting thing when I think about all your data belong to us is a lot of times when I go into customers, especially in talking to the engineers, there's this obsession with making sure that you're using every last, latest, and greatest thing that does everything, and then building this super complex architecture where you've got like 5 different distributed systems all trying to keep in sync. And I see them up front and they say, oh, we're going to do this big fancy architecture, and sometimes that's needed, by all means. But a lot of times after talking to them, I'm just like, you can do a lot of this straight out of your search engine. If you haven't looked at something like some of these Lucene-based search engines recently, especially Solar, for instance, yesterday we talked about the streaming aggregations, the SQL interfaces, all of those kinds of things. You can often put all of your stuff in a search engine like Solar. Right? You can do graph operations, you can do streaming you can do some of these streaming operations where you're doing joins and all of that kind of stuff. Because at the end of the day, if you think about your use cases, what I usually tell people is if my first use case is search, and then my secondary use case is kind of batch or analytical operations, search engine can win that one hands down. You don't need 2 different systems in sync there. If your primary use cases is more large-scale analytics, I used to say that's where you do need 2 systems. Now these days, with a lot of the analytical systems being built into Lucene and its derivatives, you can actually do all of this in the engine as well. So I would encourage you to think about how can you simplify your operations. As engineers, you often don't think about the pain that you put on your DevOps people. But trust me, if you think about it, one distributed system is hard. Two distributed systems in sync is significantly harder, right? So try to reduce that load, try to simplify. You can't always do it, but I would encourage you to go back and think about it, and you might be surprised at what some of these more modern data stores that have search as the first application do. So for instance, we have customers who use Solar as a key value store, and they're doing upwards of 100, 200,000 writes per second and reads per second. We've got customers who are doing millions of writes per second. These are all possible in modern search engine architectures. Probably my second favorite game after Super Mario, although I'm primarily a classic Legend of Zelda player and not so much the modern ones here. But another thing that I think a lot of people in search applications don't think about is how to use time-based data, right? They don't think about the fact that newer information is better than older information, or maybe some people do. That's kind of the easy one, is to boost by recency. That one's been around a long time. But for instance, they don't take account of how people are interacting with the data, what people are doing right now versus last week versus last year. They're not thinking about how to leverage all of this stuff. Things like session information. A lot of people treat queries just as one single event, and the next event has nothing to do with it. But if you actually look at good academic research around sessionization and all of those kinds of things, and if you look at how people rewrite their queries over time, you can take advantage of that kind of time information as well to provide better relevance for your users. Kind of we'll do a little Einstein mashing here. Time and space. The other side of this is how people are using space. Now, a lot of people who do local search, space obviously is a very key part of that. If you're not familiar, this is maybe too much of an American reference. It's called Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego? This is one of those games that your teacher made you play because it taught you geography. But there's a lot of interesting spatial data out there as well, whether that's just something you're getting from IP addresses and doing reverse DNS lookups, or whether you're taking advantage of time zone information, or you're taking advantage of the fact that a user happens to live in the north and it's winter. And so when they search for shovels, chances are they mean snow shovels and not, gardening shovels. So taking advantage of all of those kinds of things, thinking about how spatial data can be leveraged in your system. This spatial stuff is all very tightly integrated in with Lucene and Solar and related engines, so you can go and apply a lot of really interesting spatial operations on top of your data. The other thing I'll say on this is that notice that I'm using the word spatial and not geospatial. This isn't necessarily just about latitude and longitude. The spatial capabilities that come in Lucene can actually do some really interesting things when you think about how do I map this out into an n-dimensional space. So there's a lot of other good talks on that. If you just Google things like using Solar Spatial for non-spatial problems, you should find some good talks on that kind of stuff. For instance, you can leverage this to model when an office or a restaurant is open or closed. That was really hard to do in other ways, but it's really simple using the spatial capabilities. Any Sims fans out there? A good friend of mine who's based here in Berlin actually worked on the very first SimCity project, so this one's a fun one to talk about too. I think this is kind of goes along with this notion that we as developers often only think about queries as individual queries, and they're all kind of isolated, and we very often forget about users. I think as developers, it's like, users, why do I have to bother them? Or why do they have to bother me? right? Isn't that something that the marketing team should be worrying about, or the finance team, et cetera? I see a lot of engineers where they just do not spend any amount of time trying to understand the users at all. The interesting thing is if you look at the evolution of search over the past 5-10 years, if you look at like what Google and the big providers do, it's all about modeling the users. You know, the intent, or the user intent side of things. Knowing that, for instance, when a user asks, when does the shuttle leave for the airport, and they're at a hotel, it doesn't mean they want 10 blue links with 10 different shuttles. They want to know the answer to when does this shuttle that I'm at for this hotel leave to the airport. And so they want an answer back that says, 5 p.m. or whatever it is. And so this is all about, if you were at the Learning to Rank session earlier by Andrew Clegg, this is all about trying to learn and understand what users are doing by looking at all of the features that you can capture about your users and then feeding them back in. And I think actually one of the interesting things that we've been doing is we actually put all of this user behavior data right back into Solr. And that does two things for us. One, it allows us to search against all of our user data, which has this incredible democratization effect on an organization. Because it's too often the case that user data is all locked up in Omniture, and only marketing gets to see it, and the engineers only get to see it when it's not performing very well. Or it's locked up in IT, and the only people who ever get to see it are those who know SQL and who can write queries against it. Maybe you get a visualization or a report on this data, but chances are you don't, all right? And so by capturing all of this stuff into your search engine, you can then give a search interface to it, and then now everybody in the organization can know what matters to users. And I think that's a really important first step for companies to try to account for it. And then, of course, once you get beyond that, now you can start to process it. You can build recommendation engines. You can do statistical models around, trying to predict how users are going to behave per query, per session, per rewrite, all of those kinds of things. Next up, this is, I think, the really old Metal Gear Solid, which is one of the first kind of sniper or spy type games where the whole point of the game was to not get detected. So in some sense, this slide is about the opposite of that, of how do you detect when something's wrong. I think, the search world has kind of forgotten a lot of the early work around alerting. It used to be called document routing back in like the 80s, or document filtering, et cetera. One of the nice things, though, to come out of some of the recent log-based search capabilities like Splunk, et cetera, is that alerting on a search engine is now in vogue again. I like to think and take it another level. It's not just about alerting on logs or alerting on specific documents. It's this notion that as we get more and more data, you want to be more proactive with your users about how they're interacting with you. And again, so if you start to weave together time and space and data flowing in a streaming way, you start to get a better picture of when should I send something to a user and when should I not. And you can craft much more interesting queries that can then run constantly and alert customers, alert users anytime they want. One of the other interesting trends in the search space, I think, is actually a broader data platform trend, in that if you go and we abstract ourselves and think about what all of these different projects are trying to do and what all the different vendors are trying to do, is everybody wants to own all of your data. Every vendor wants all of your data. Guilty as charged. I want all your data in my product. Anybody who doesn't agree to that probably is lying, right? And so one of the things that's been really interesting is all of these other data platforms, databases, et cetera, they've been adding search capabilities. Some do a better job than others. Well, the search people haven't been sitting on their hands either. They've been adding a lot of database-like qualities, such that nowadays you can do joins, you can do grouping, you can do have and all kinds of traditional database operations. And in fact, if you were at Shaolin, my colleagues talked yesterday, Solr itself has a full SQL front end to it. So all those people that know SQL, you can go use SQL. And yes, I get the irony of saying no SQL when I mean K-N-O-W. The other thing that I think at a more interesting level is to take this notion around puzzles up a level. So it's one thing to join at documents, individual documents. It's another thing to start to think about how can a search engine be used to piece together a puzzle over time. I wish I had thought of this. There's a gentleman by the name of Jeff Jonas who works at IBM, and he has a really great talk on thinking about the data puzzle and how as data flows in, you get a much more complete picture of what users are doing and what matters and what the data actually means. So for instance, you might have just a username first. And then later on, you might get a username and an address, and then that same username and another address, and so on and so forth. And as you think about all that data flowing together, you have all of these problems around which data do I trust? Which data actually matters? What data can I reason about? And so this is where things like graph stores and stuff like that can help. But at the end of the day, you can sometimes think about leveraging a search engine to build out this linkage. And in fact, this whole space is called record linkage. And a search engine, it can be really helpful in solving that problem. It's not the solution for that problem, but it is often a pretty interesting part of that problem, especially when you start to think about doing things like fuzzy string matching and all of those kinds of things. How many people have voice interfaces on their search application now? Nobody. Well, you know, I don't know the last time you talked to your phone, but you better get one. Maybe in the next year, maybe in the next 2 years. This is something I think that's coming, obviously a lot more. Open source is frankly way behind here. So if you want to go start up, if you know anything about speech recognition, please go start an open source project. There are a couple out there, but they're pretty cumbersome and hard to train and all of that kind of stuff. I won't spend too much time on voice other than one of the things you need to think about with voice is that you are more likely to get real natural language from your user, right? And so that brings a whole host of other problems for you as an engineer, right? Because now you've got to figure out what actually matters in the query beyond just the keywords. You've got to parse however many different languages. You have to deal with the fact that voice to text is not a perfect science and that you're going to have a lot of garbage in your queries. And so how do you deal, what strategies do you have for dealing with bad user input? Similar things to like people can't spell, so on and so forth. So if you're not thinking about voice, if you're especially a consumer-facing application, this is something I would encourage you to look at. We're actually starting to see this with some of our clients behind the firewall as well in the enterprise, especially in places like call centers where they want to have their account managers be able to just talk to the engine and get back results. So lots of interesting things going on in this space, especially the deep learning work has been really showing some really interesting capabilities around voice. There are some decent voice-based APIs that you can just call out to, but they still need a lot of work. Last but not least, on the thinking about best practices, this is one that's really near and dear to my heart, and I see a lot of people struggle with relevance, and I see a lot of engineers who kind of blow off relevance because, let's face it, it's a hard problem, it's a squishy problem, right? I mean, we've got all this fuzziness going on, and especially for most engineers who were trained in databases and doing relational logic, this notion of squishiness or fuzziness is not something that we're used to, right? And so what do you mean this result that was #1 today is not #1 tomorrow? Like that's just fundamentally a hard, but I did the exact same query, right? And so we often then fall back to what we are good at. And I see a lot of engineers, I walk in the door and they're like, we do 10,000 queries per second. And they're really proud of that, and they should be, because that's a good scaling system, right? But then I often ask them the question, well, what if you only had to do 8,000 queries per second? What would that change? Could you cut your hardware by 10%? How much would your business love you if you saved 10% on your hardware? Well, what if some of that savings actually came from the fact that you had better relevance? What if you realized, after you look at all of your logs, that users are typing and trying to fix the fact that your relevance sucks? Right? What if that were the case? What if when they came in and they typed in their query and they found it right there and then they went and bought it? How much happier would your business team be? As opposed to they had to do rewrites, you had to do all of these other things to try to get them onto the right set of results. And so if you're not familiar, this is the original Legend of Zelda, and this is part called the Lost Woods. And if you didn't do a particular pattern, you could not get out of the Lost Woods. And so one of the things I try to encourage people to do is, right from the get-go as an engineer, not as the business person, etc., think about what your relevant strategies are going to be. Think about how you're going to capture user feedback. Think about all of the things that go into relevance, or at least be prepared for those kinds of things by capturing the information up front. You may not know how to use all of your clickstream data right when you get going, but if you don't capture it, you certainly aren't going to be able to do anything with it. I also encourage you, this goes back to that democratization of the data, make sure that you're ingrained with your business people about getting information about what your customers care about, because then when your boss comes in with that pet peeve query and says, hey, query X doesn't work, you can say, okay, boss, which would you like me to work on? Your query, which no one ever does but you, or these top 20, which make 90% of our business, our money, right? All of a sudden, your boss says, wow, you're really smart, and lets you go do your job, as opposed to bothering you incessantly about that. So I would encourage you all to stop and ask directions. If you don't know, in Zelda, there was a little cave way off on the other side of the map where the woman in the cave told you how to get out of the Lost Woods. At the end of the day, what you really need is a plan to think about how to leverage all of these kinds of things, right? I see a lot of customers who come in and they're just like, oh, well, Lucene and Solar, that's my search checkbox. And 5, 10 years ago, when we started this company in 2007, so about 9 years ago almost. Back then, keywords, 10 blue links. Game over, sign the check, we're all happy. And then Google came, Google upped its game, Amazon upped its game, Facebook upped its game, and you now realize that this core matching that something like Lucene does, this core, take something like BM25 or the vector space model or any of these core ranking algorithms. I've seen some people say that that only gets you about 50% of the way when it comes to relevance, especially in consumer-facing applications. I was once sitting next to the CTO of a very large public search engine, and he made the claim out loud in front of a bunch of academics that BM25 in his situation only got him 52% of the way. If you think about that, if you're ever on the academic side of things, BM25 is held up as the gold standard for search relevance. This guy was a heretic saying it only gets you just a little bit better than guessing, or a little bit better than 52%. So all of these other things, by planning around them and incorporating them into your application, thinking about them from day one, that's the rest of the way, right? User signals. What are people clicking on? What are they sharing? What are they tweeting? What are they buying? All of those kinds of things. Time and space. What was interesting today is not necessarily going to be interesting tomorrow. Have a plan for how you're going to bring these in accordingly. Choose an engine that allows you to do these kinds of things. Make sure that the data that defines success in this isn't way off separate, because I guarantee you if that data that is going to help you get all this feedback is off in some system that's really hard to get to or locked up in a third party like an Omniture or a Google Analytics, you're not going to have it when you need it. And so bring it in to your application and make better use of it. The next thing, I would encourage you again, go, if you didn't see Andrew Klieg's talk on learning to rank, at the end of the day, you always have to be learning on this stuff. I would encourage you to start to think about how do you incorporate machine learning into your core ranking functions, because it's a great way to grab all of those features, including the content, the clicks, the events, and learn from it and make for a better application. So it's, like I said, it's squishy at times. It's hard to wrap your head around the math, but there's a lot of good libraries out there. If you're a Solar user, there's a patch that I think is pretty close to being committed that actually makes learning to rank in Solar a native operation. You still have to train your models offline, but you can plug those kinds of things in. Works in distributed at scale. And so make sure your system and application is learning. It goes without saying that as an engineer, this is something you should apply to your own life as well. Get out of that trap of your assumptions and make sure that you are learning the latest and greatest as well and how to incorporate that. I don't have anything about Phoenix Wright. My son really likes this game, so it's an attorney game. So I'd encourage you to check that one out. And then I just want to leave you with what I think is one of the really interesting things to think about in this space. And if you don't play a lot of games, this is Skyrim, the Elder Scrolls 5. And one of the interesting things about this game is it's a total free play game. There's lots of these free play games out there, right? The interesting thing that I think about is it's a great time to be a developer, and it's a great time to be in the search development space. You got a ton of data, you got a ton of computing, and you've got a ton of users. And so I would encourage you again to start exploring some of these ideas. Think about ways that you can incorporate more of this into your application. Basically start treating this as a free play space where you can say, how do I drive down the cost of experimentation in my application such that my business can then fail and fail very fast? And then learn from those failures and get better and better and better. Some people say if you look at companies like Google and Facebook and all of that, and you look at their search results, I don't know the exact numbers, but I've seen estimates that only about 10% of all users on internet search ever see what that company considers to be the best version of their search engine. Think about that. I guarantee you almost everyone in the room here, you have one version of your search engine, maybe two. Every now and then you tweak your search formula or you lowercase your fields or whatever. And then maybe you do A/B testing on that. A lot of you people don't. I've seen a lot of e-commerce companies that don't, for instance, and that's like core to their business. But if you start to think about if you can drive down that experimentation cost, now you have a lot more room to play. Because you get to be wrong, and that's a really powerful thing as an engineer is the ability to be wrong because everybody looks at you to be right. And instead you can say, oh, I was wrong on that one, but guess what? I've got the system in place that shows me I'm wrong, therefore I'm actually right because the next time around, the next experiment is going to be right. So with that, I think we got time for maybe one or two questions. Miss Pac-Man, that's my all-time favorite, right up there with Super Mario Brothers, so. A lot of quarters spent on that game as well.
Thanks, Grant.
Otherwise, thank you. Oh, and by the way, if you want a more hands-on, lower-level coding, I'm doing a workshop at 4:30, and we'll explore a lot of these ideas using Solar and Spark. So,
are there questions or comments? Any questions?
All right.
Right.
It's hot in here. Oh, got one right there.
Okay, I'd like to get in with something. Grant, can I thank you for all the coffee I've been drinking over the last 2 days? I think we all appreciate that. Okay?
Thank you. Yeah, that's the marketing team, but yeah, I've taken advantage of the coffee as well. So, yeah, like I said, thank you guys. Thank everyone. Solar and Spark, hands-on. We'll show you this stuff live in an hour.
Thanks again.